I think as artists, your identity is wrapped a little bit in what you do, what you create, and how the world perceives it. At a certain point, this is not about the story I want to create, it's the world's. I have to hold this with an open hand, craft it the way that we think is best for the audience we're trying to serve, versus some artistic thing that doesn't resonate with anyone. It doesn't even really get to the point that we were trying to go after in the first place.
I'm stoked to have you, dude. You are a super talented filmmaker. I've been a fan for a number of years. We've done a little bit of work together, but mostly I've just been like watching your stuff and you know, staying abreast on what you're doing over time. So David, a few years ago, made a documentary called 25 and 24 that follows John Foreman of Switchfoot. I'm going to ask you about that in a little bit. And then most recently, you directed a documentary called Borrowed Future: How Student Loans Are Killing the American Dream. And I watched this recently, and we're going to talk mostly about this. And I want to talk about the content first, like the topic of that documentary. So like I've noticed that this topic is people get very passionate about it. Even in my own house, like we've had super strong debates about, you know, what go to college, don't go to college, what's the worth of it, and it seems like the America at least is getting a little more polarized on this. And I have very strong feelings on it too, but I'll reserve those for now. But why do you think this? Why do you think we have a culture that is so specifically saying this is the path? You have to strap on all this debt in order to become a fully functioning, you know, adult human being in society.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I really appreciate the kind words and thank you for having me on, man. It's an honor to be here and glad to have this conversation. Yeah, so student loans, why is it so polarizing? It's when we were digging through the research and really understanding the how college and education first started getting implemented into our culture. Um, it was to get knowledge, to make a better life for yourself, and all good things, right? But when that starts to become the standard and that starts to become like the only path, and it just grows into the ethos over time, and the majority of folks say, yes, this is it, this is the way, this is how you go about it, you kind of feel shame or guilt for not doing that, or well, everybody else is doing it. Let me just go with that flow. And I think that's the challenge that we have seen over the years is that you have young kids that are like 16, 17 starting to make these decisions and enter college around 18 years of age and are set on this path by adults telling them do this, and then they get out in 4 years and they have no clue what they want to do. And they're strapped with all this debt, but yet they've been told, do this, do this. It's going to get you a good job. It's going to get you to where you want to go. And that's just not necessarily the case. There's not necessarily one direct line to get there. And I think, especially in the evolution of the world we live in now, where knowledge is so accessible, it's kind of exposed this even more, where you've got the folks that have kind of done an alternate route. Yeah, it's not pointing a finger and being like, hey, see, we told you, but it's just one of those things that it's exposed kind of that fracture of maybe it isn't the only way. And maybe we should start empowering teenagers and showing them, hey, here's the alternative ways to grow in skill sets, to gain experience, to really understand the things you like, things you don't like, where you can win in business, in the workforce, versus just go this way.
There's this line in the movie, one of your interviews, where he's likening it to the conversations that they had with basically teenagers in World War II before D-Day,
Yeah.
where he's like, you know, most of you aren't going to make it. And these doe-eyed kids are just like, well, it sucks to be that guy. Let's go, right? And the
Yeah.
point he's making is like, our brains really aren't capable of taking on the weight of that decision, right?
Hmm.
At that age. And so it feels the travesty of it all to me feels like even the people who have gone through that process, been strapped with debt, been paying that debt off for decades, they still could perpetuate it and say,
Yep.
it's just the way it is. You got to do this.
Yeah, and we've become so comfortable with that process too, which is like even a deeper layer within that story and in that the theme of the film is like we've just accepted a culture of debt, and this is how it is, and just pick up your shoulders and dig in because that's how we all do this, and it's like no, that doesn't need to be the case. So it's a good. It was a really good project to dig into all that stuff. We learned so much during it about the process, and even just learning ways that people did it differently, which was really, really cool.
Yeah, I love that. I want to dig in on that a little bit. So you made this film with Dave Ramsey's production company. How did
Mhm.
it come? Which makes sense. How did it come about? Tell us how it came.
Yeah, so I think it was back in the fall of 2018. We were all sitting around a table there. I'd been working there since 2013, and we'd been growing and building the production department, and the company had been growing a lot. And the bread and butter, we had a lot of great products. Dave's The Ramsey Show, the radio show, that's just been a massive success. And it was like, well, hey, how do we start getting into new markets, and how do we start getting new ears, new eyeballs on stuff? And documentaries had really hit this renaissance over the past couple of years, and just everybody's sitting around the water cooler talking about what docs they watched. And it was like, okay, how do we take this message into that form and create some type of edutainment, if you will, in a lean back experience? Because a lot of our products there were classroom and more like educational lean in, because you're helping people understand behaviors around debt and helping them walk through and get control of their finances. So this was just another avenue to do that. And we were looking at a couple different topics, and student loans was very much a hot button issue. And we were thinking like, hey, do we want to tackle this? Is this like a flash in the pan thing? Or is there something like really in there? And fortunately, the podcast department had done a 6 or 8 episode podcast series called Borrowed Future on the student debt crisis. And so that was kind of like the incubator for this idea. And that really resonated with audiences. And it was one of those things where it's like, okay, hey, if that had an audience base, and this is something that is very much in the zeitgeist of culture, we'd be pretty pissed if somebody else made a student loan documentary, and when we know that it's probably not going to be communicating the things that we value and maybe steering folks in the right direction. And so our hope was, all right, if we can do a student loan project, how can we not just complain about the problem? How do we provide and offer solutions? Because that's really the goal is for this, because you could skin this cat a number of different ways, but our goal really was, hey, for someone watching this, how do we connect with the 16, 17, 18-year old
Right.
and show them that this doesn't have to be the path? Prevent it before it actually happens for them.
Yeah. As something I loved about the film is I went into it thinking it was just going to be a giant complaint fest,
Yeah.
it certainly spotlights the problem, and I can feel it emotionally, as we should. But you didn't. You had a lot more nuance than that. You came at it from multiple different angles, which we'll get into. So I like to ask. People love to hear details, so I'm just going to ask you details. Do
Yeah.
you remember the budget of the film? What were you given?
We were given, man, I think about 150 to $200,000 max
Yeah.
to execute on that. And it was great. Like I say that from the sense of those were the hard costs we spent. We had a great team that we built there, and we utilized some of the amazing talent at Ramsey Solutions to execute on it. So it was all internal resources to develop it. So production costs, flights, travel, all that stuff, insurance, things like that. Rounded out to about, I think around 200. And, but yeah, everything else was done in-house except for
Yeah.
the color.
And how long did it take start to finish?
So we started we started interviews in fall of 2019, late summer, early fall, and we did principal photography all the way through early 2020. And then of course, we had a couple productions right on the cusp when, the world started shutting down. It's like, okay. And I remember thinking, all right, well, those pieces we don't have right now. And I remember walking into the edit room with my editor, and I was like, okay, if this is all we have, what kind of story are we going to make here? And we just started cranking away and working through that, which was great. And when the world started opening up a little bit, we were able to capture a couple, pickups and additional story pieces to fill in some of the gaps and flavor of the story that really helped bring it whole. But I think end to end, post probably took us about 9 months over about a 12-month stretch, and production was all in all probably about 10 weeks over 8 months.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Cool.
yeah.
You're teeing up my next question pretty well. I think about structure, film structure, story structure, especially for documentaries, and like the analogy that comes to my mind is like when I was a kid, when I was playing with my kids when they were younger, we always would play Legos. And
Yeah.
there was two ways that we would build with Legos, and it just depended on the night. Their mom was waitressing, and so I would have the kids at night, and we would stretch out on the floor and a pile of Legos, and I would either have them pick out a bunch of parts, and I had to make something from these parts, or I would say, "What do you want me to make?" And I would seek those parts out of that pile. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about sort of your approach to documentary filmmaking, and because it's different, it was different between the two films, um, and I'm sure it's some combination of both. But talk me through your process with structure. What do you prefer?
Yeah, so we went in with I like to have my ducks in a row as best as possible before going into conversations or having a game plan before we really hit production, like anybody really does. And knowing like, all right, this is what we have to walk away from this conversation with, and everything else that we explore and go into, I know that like if it takes 2 hours to get to that point, I got that. And then this stuff we'll figure out like, hey, does it have weight and value to the story? So that was really the approach going into production. And I remember getting into post for this one, and we just had this massive whiteboard in the edit room, and every bucket of content. And it was about like 60, 70 hours worth of just raw content. And we're like, okay, we got a lot of voices, which we know we may not use all of them. And unfortunately, we didn't. But yeah, I remember thinking, I thought I know how to build and craft story, but this is such a bigger beast. And I started just diving into more like books and podcasts on folks that I admire, folks in the business, and how they go about, specifically in the documentary space, building and crafting story. Because, granted, it's all very similar in the pattern, but especially in the doc space, it's like they call it story finding in the post process, where it's like,
Right.
hey, here was the framework. But now that we've got all the tangibles, it's different than the narrative side where it's like, all right, we've got the script, the storyboards. There's still nuance and changes, but it's not a paint by numbers by any means,
No.
but it's a little bit more linear, right? Doc is like, well, let's, figure out how these pieces play. And if they don't, and what do we discover in the process? And so I think that exploration and digging into developing my own story chops and taking it to essentially a new level was very helpful and normalize the fact that like, okay, this is the process and just be diligent within the process to review everything. If you've got multiple people saying the same thing, you have to, and it's all gold, you have to slice out only the one that says it the best, that brings the best value, and keep it in, and the rest goes. And there was some times where my editor and some of the other folks close to it, we'd just be in there and we wouldn't be even chopping anything. We would just literally be litigating the transcripts and the perspectives and who's saying it, and would spend, 20, 30, 40 minutes getting it to a decision to remove this line or to remove this person or to restructure it this way, which was great. And there's a whole nother side there because there's this misconception, I think, that if you're the director of the project, then like you have it all, you know it all, like it's your vision. And ultimately, yes, on paper that's true, but it's not like it's truly a collaborative process. And I have a perspective, and I'm very aware that that might not be the best perspective. And that's why I think in this process, working with people that I genuinely trusted, where I'm like, okay, this is how I feel about this. I need to tell me your perspective and push back. And what I'll do is I know I have to make the final call, but this is a safe space where I am very much going to evaluate. And if it is the better idea, it is very much going to, we will take, it's not about my ideas, it's about what's the best idea. And so, yeah, that was the process of working through those 60 hours of content to figure out who were the right perspectives, what was the right angles, what pieces that we thought we were supposed to have in there didn't matter. Because originally the story was going to be an all encapsulated, like, hey, this is how you can do it and go to college without debt. And then we were also going to include, hey, if you have debt, this is how you can pay it off, and really try to infuse that piece. But when we put it all together, it was like, well, there's no consequence. If I'm 18 years old and it's like, okay, then you're saying like, I can enjoy my 4 years and I can take on this debt. But if I really work and really, dig in for 5 years after, I can pay it off. That is true. And if you do take it on, we hope you do that. But our goal is to show you like, no, not everybody gets out of this alive. Not everybody gets out of this safe. And to eliminate that piece of how you can pay off the debt. And it really just left the folks that had the debt in this really desperate, unresolved state that I think registers more with the target audience of, you don't have to do this. And if you do this, this is what the consequence looks like.
Yeah. And from an engagement standpoint, I mean, story without conflict is no story at all, right? There's nothing there without conflict. So your statement about consequence very much is the conflict, right? And I felt that was cool. Another thing about engagement is right up front, you had some social proof with faces that we recognize, right? Seth Godin, Mike Rowe, Dave Ramsey. And I think that's super smart because right off the bat, I'm like, it validated the topic. It's like, yeah, we're going to dig further into this topic, but here's some, and of course it doesn't need validation, but our minds, the way that what we're used to is like, oh, this person's willing to talk about it. It must be important. Right. So, but I found myself doing the same thing. I was like, oh, dang, they're in here too. So that was really cool. Just ask them to be in it and they're in it. Are they paid or what? How did that come about?
Yeah, I think that was a fortunate piece with Dave and his just deep relationships with so many people across so many different networks and platforms. We had relationships with Seth, with Mike, with some of the other faces that were in there. And they were very willing to allow us to come be in their space, take an hour and a half of their time. And it was a really enjoyable process. Yeah, Seth Godin's such a very thoughtful individual, and I was fascinated with that conversation with him and learned so much through that. And it was great to just have all those perspectives. It's funny, like the Mike Rose pieces in there. He was in a lot more, but he's such a big presence. And it's funny when I tell people that he's only got like three lines in the piece, but his lines, like I was saying earlier, drive so much value, and to your
Oh
point,
yeah.
validates so much.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we were very fortunate to have some of those inroads, and obviously we had to work with some licensing and some restriction stuff, but yeah, it was really good. It was really good to
Yeah.
have those relationships.
All right, more about your craft. Are you a shot lister?
I am. So here's the truth. If I could, I'd storyboard it out. Like I said, I like to be prepared because I have found myself on set just constantly being like, "Oh, we should try this. Oh, we should try this. Oh, we should try this." And that's not the best. Here I am, 43, still thinking I'm like the anxious, 20 something, like, oh yeah, let's get that, Mac, let's try this angle. Because then my post brain is thinking like options are the best. And I'm like, no, David, just stick to the plan. This is what not that you can't expand creativity, but there's creativity really happens when you've got constraints on, right?
No
And
doubt.
so knowing what we have to go after, it helps put myself in a box in a good way, and the rest of the crew isn't like, okay, can we just move on from this?
I love it. Yeah. I mean, these are the challenges we all face. Anybody that's jumped into it. And that's the same in scripted too. I don't know how much scripted you've done,
Hmm.
but I'll be on set and then try to figure I'll want new things that weren't in the storyboard or in the
Yep.
shot list. And I'm like, do we have time for that? So I'm always fighting with the AD about getting a little bit more time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
all right, here's a few things from the film that I loved. The history montage, 17 minutes in, that
Yeah.
it almost stands alone as an expose on Sally Mae, and
Hmm.
it was darker than I realized. Like that was cool. That was a cool sequence. Is that something you knew, or tell me about the things that you learned in the process of making this?
Yeah. Uh, Honestly, yeah, that was pretty dark. I would say learning how the government subsidizes it, fed itself, and how just predatory it is in nature. And it was something that ideally was designed to help people make a better life for themselves, and it was capped at a certain point as to not like just totally throw people into crazy debt enslavement. But, when you get business and people involved in it and they see where they can, where there's an angle to make more money, more profit, that's where it really starts to get twisted. And so learning that was like, oh man, this actually is darker and way more dangerous than people are aware of. And we're, in the news and you know, different political parties, like, and all the arguments and stuff that are happening. It's like a veneer of like what's really the problem way
Yeah,
underneath. And it was like, how do we bring this to light? How do we bring this to light in a way that that one is engaging and is telling the right story because there's so much information here. And I remember sitting down with my visual effects supervisor, and we were storyboarding and scripting this thing out. And if you're familiar with Ramsey Solutions, it's very warm, real, and bold. Those are the core themes of the brand. And we're like, well, how are we going to tell this? Like, this is the antithesis of like warm. It's real and bold, but it's very dark. And so I remember we were putting this together and we're like, all right, like this is a lot of work. And if it doesn't resonate, then we're like back to square one with a lot of hours and a lot of creative just
I
like
loved it.
off to the wayside.
Yeah, it
And
was awesome.
when there's a specific moment where it hits, where I think at the end where the student's there and the chain starts going around them and it starts, sweeping over. It is one of those things I remember in the edit room with my exec producers when we were doing a viewing of it, they were just like, oh man, that is amazing. And it was like, okay, cool. We struck the right chord and it tells the right thing, which was great.
It
So
did.
very proud of that
And
piece for sure.
And you didn't stay there. That's the thing. Like great art pieces are dynamic. They have movement. They have change. And a few things I loved. The scholarship segment that felt very pro student. It felt pro young
Hmm.
person, right? Because you can't tell this story and not talk about the fact that young people are forced to make this decision and they're kind of dopey. Well, at least that's part of what, like, we were all dopey, right? But but then
Hmm.
we're
Yeah.
but then we're expecting them to choose this. But then the scholarship segment was kind of cool. It was very small, short, but it was still like, hey, it felt pro student. It felt pro that
Hmm.
character, right, in the
Yep.
story, which was cool.
Yeah.
Same thing with the lawnmower flipper. That story. I mean, he's like,
Hmm.
that was
David.
resonated as an entrepreneur. Like the get after it. Like yes, there are other ways. That was cool.
Yeah.
I dug
Yeah.
that.
He
So
he was
how'd you
fantastic,
find
man.
how'd you
Yeah.
find those stories? Do you put out feelers? Do you ask people? Do you have a whole pool of stories and then you pull from that you knew were available and then pull from it?
Yeah, so this will be a little bit of process, I guess, too. So this goes back to just very fortunate to have the network that Dave had. And so the podcast that was the kind of the, not incubator, but the Borrowed Future podcast that was created already had a nice catalog of stories that we had, put out feelers for during the recording through the network, through the radio show. And so we were able to solicit a lot of feedback, a lot of people that were hitting some of the like defined characters we were looking for, perspectives, I should say. People that had it, what kind of volume did they have? How do they, get it? And then also, hey, as we were working through it, like we need perspectives of people who have gone the alternative ways. And I remember we put that feeler out, and David had he was about to graduate college, and he had intersected with uh, Dave's the Ramsey Foundation's high school foundations program, which helps teach high schoolers how to avoid debt completely and how to really set up their financial success at an early age. And coming out of high school, he's like, "Well, I'm not going to take on any student debt." And he was just incredibly resourceful, as you see in the film. And so he wrote in, we're just like, this guy, oh my goodness, we've got to get a camera in front of him, follow his
Cool.
journey, which was amazing. And Christina, the expert who got $1 million in scholarships, it's crazy. Like that is, but that was her thing of how do I avoid this? And was just like militant with digging in and figuring it out, and was like, and now her platform is very much like, hey, I've done it. I've done a ton of the hard work. Let me help other students really figure out where these scholarships are, because that's the thing. There's so much out there that's just
Right.
not capitalized on, and that's free money for students to be able to use to avoid a lot of the student debt.
The not so subtle takeaway when comparing these different characters is, do you care enough? Are you an active character, a proactive
Hmm.
character, or are you more passive? Like, float along, do the thing, just things will be fine. Like, there was a
Yeah.
very marked difference between the different characters in the story
Yeah.
that way, and I think that was very valuable to show that.
Yeah.
Um, so the the film is on YouTube. Let's talk about distribution. What was the
Yeah.
original plan for distribution?
Netflix. And of course, right? Netflix. And we had some inroads there. We had sent a teaser to them, which they were interested in, and then we showed them like an early assembly edit, and it got some really great notes and feedback from their unscripted department, and very grateful that they reviewed it. And yeah, it was good. Ultimately, they passed, but we were able to really like take those notes and infuse those into how it needed to be shaped. Also, we screened it, I think, for MGM and their unscripted department, and that was some of the most impactful feedback too. Really appreciated the raw honesty there. And so there were a couple other like studios in town here that they were gracious enough to take their time to watch it and sit with us and provide notes, and that really helped us shape the story. But when it came to distribution, towards that leg. It was like, okay, well, what are we going to do? We could go a couple different routes. We could, put it on our website and, just distribute it that way. But ultimately, it came down to what do we want the audience to experience? And back to, we wanted them to have that lean back experience where it's, a Friday night, Thursday night, whatever, like, what do I want to watch? And so let me
Yeah.
engage in it that way. And so we started to look around like, all right, well, can we put it on, the digital platforms and more of a TVOD um, based distribution? And that's where we engaged with an aggregator, and they're escaping my mind, but they were fantastic. So Amazon, Apple, Google, all big tech companies. Sure, we
Yeah.
think of them as like entertainment when we think of those platforms, but they're not. They're data companies, and really an aggregator serves as kind of like a distributor for them. And we were able to work with that aggregator and their relationships with Apple, Amazon, and Google to get in their stores. And with Amazon, it was one where they had recently shut down a lot of their anybody can get in. I think they had
Yeah.
picked their heads up and realized, wait, we got a catalog of stuff we just don't really care about and don't want, and nobody's looking. And so with that, they reviewed the film, and fortunately enough, they took the submission and put it on their platform. And for the first several months, I think we were in TVOD, hit some of the high ranks in those platforms, and then Amazon accepted it just as a Prime uh, film in their
Feature.
catalog, which
Yeah.
was really cool. Yeah. And then we just continued. We ultimately released it on YouTube to get the message out there. Yeah, it was definitely a process, but we were very fortunate to land that distribution because, yeah, it's interesting in that space because you spend so much time working on something. It's like, well, how am I going to get this out in the world?
Right.
And that's the other challenge. You do the whole challenge of trying to create the thing, and then it's like, well, where do I need to put the thing? And so we were looking at festivals. We were just a bunch of different things and understanding just the inner politics of like, all right, if you go to a festival, it's like first like reveal, like the big premiere. That's where you get the most bang for selling the piece. And is that the route to take? Or so I'd encourage anybody. It's like what every doc's different. You're trying to get a message out into the world. Sometimes is it more about the eyeballs or is it more about recouping ROI? And there's different ways to go about doing that. And so just yeah, define what that goal is. And for us, it was very much eyeballs, and which was why when it released, we gave it away for free to every teacher in America, high school, college, and it was really cool to get some of the responses from teachers on when they watched it and shared it with their students. So
Yeah.
long
And
answer to a short question.
no, it's good. Um, a couple follow-ups. So if you were to do it again and you're doing it on your own, right? The key takeaways.
Yeah.
Um, well, first, before we go there, did the film make its money back, do you think?
I believe it did. I wasn't too clued in
Yeah.
on the financial metrics as we progressed along. We were trying to figure out what was the next step in the storytelling
Totally.
space for Ramsey. So,
And in the end
but
of the
all in all,
film,
yeah.
there's a call to there's like a URL, and so I was like, okay, so this is part of their funnel, and this can help,
Hmm.
right? This can help. This is
Yeah,
another way that it can make money.
yeah.
Um, so that stands to be like a strong fallback. If you were doing it again, and I was particularly struck by you were said you got strong, candid, raw feedback from a number of parties. How
Hmm.
much did it change? How much did the story structure change from that feedback, and how much did that shape you for the next time around if you're making something?
Yeah, so we had been in the slog for a while, and I think it was February or late January of 21. And you're kind of like, okay, can we just be, can we, we got something here. And MGM reviewed it, and we got some very good, harsh feedback that like, hey, this is good. And I think their little literal words were, this is good for a trapped audience. We're like, oh, so trapped audience, what do you mean? It's like, oh, if it's in a classroom and, or if they're like, they have to watch this. And it was just one of those where it's like, okay,
It's like a backhanded
okay.
compliment.
Oh yeah, totally. And you're already just like my whole identity is like wrapped into, all the crazy insecurities that go into it. But listening to that, and then we got off the call, and I was sitting with my EP, a great guy, and we're kind of like, okay. And he looks at me, he's like, well, what do you think? And I was just like, all right, I need like 2 months just in the hole working through this, reshaping it. And we'll get it there. I'm not trying to play hero ball, but just like, okay, I'm hearing what he's saying. I'm hearing that back to what I was saying earlier with like everybody made it out alive, right? There was not enough conflict. There was not enough, what is the consequence of this obstacle and tension, right? And it was more just like, hey, here's information from different perspectives. And that really drove us to say, okay, everything is on the table. At Ramsey, the by design, it is we bring hope to people through all in all walks of life, and everything has purpose and hope. And to not have certain characters not have hope felt very antithetical to the ethos of the company. And yet it was a choice we had to make. We weren't sure if it was like how everyone would feel about it. But I remember being like, okay, scrap it. My editor like looked back with like big eyes, like, are you sure? And I'm like, yep, we've got to do this. We've got to take it this way because we can create a story for our tribe and they'll love it. They'll eat it up. But that doesn't necessarily make the dent in culture that we want it to make. We have to tell the story the way that it is. And so that feedback informed those decisions over those couple months and allowed us to really get to what is the final product that's a little bit darker, a little bit more of consequence, but still has the hope for the student that, like the target audience, the student that I can go to school and I don't have to be like those people. I can go to
Right.
school and I can be like the lawnmower flipper. I can go to school and be like Christina, who got $1 million in scholarships.
Yeah, well, I thought it was great. I don't, without having seen those earlier cuts, I felt like this one played the dynamics of the two different, the positive and negative pretty well. So I felt the consequences, and I also felt that we're not doomed, right? There's other
Hmm.
ways, which is that
Yeah.
still hits on that proactive positivity. So good job on
Yeah.
that. And
I
I think
appreciate it. Thank you.
I think this harkens back to what I've heard so many great artists say, where kill your babies, kill your darlings, do the hard work to make it that much better. Even when you think it's good, keep slicing and dicing to make it better. You can always roll back to a different cut,
Hmm.
and if you have the
Yeah.
luxury of time. But so often as artists, we think something's there when it could be so much better. We just don't. Our eyes
Yeah.
aren't open to it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's a
good job.
good call because
Yeah.
I think that's a piece that is back to the identity pieces. I think like as artists, you kind of like your identity is wrapped a little bit in what you do, what you create, and how the world perceives it. And I think through a process like this, like you are exposed, you're vulnerable, and it's like, okay, like at a certain point, this is not about the story I want to create. This is about a story that like the world it's the world's like this is we're putting this out in the world. This is our perspective on it, but I have to hold this with an open hand. And I think Seth Godin has a great book called The Practice that I read during this that was all about the discipline of just doing the work. Like the outcome will be the outcome. But so many people focus on the outcome and I want to have this big impact. I want to be this. I want, and when I was reading it, I started to just be like, no, I'm going to let this go. We're going to diligently sit down and work through this and craft it the way that we think it serves best for the audience we're trying to serve versus some artistic thing that doesn't resonate with, anyone. It doesn't even really uh, uh, get to the point that we were trying to go after in the first place.
Hmm.
So,
Good words. Yeah. Yeah, and obviously, like docus are made different ways, and so you were very much in. This is a you could continually shape it type of thing, versus
Yeah.
like 25 and 24 where you're following and literally
Hmm.
documenting things that are happening, and that's the
Yep.
story, right?
Yep.
The
Yeah.
first documentary that I was involved in was called Swallow Your Pride, and it was that same format where we were following 6 or 7 competitive eaters in Philadelphia. I was a junior
Yeah.
producer on it. I supplied a little bit of money and some gear and stuff, but my buddies were following these competitive eaters because we knew it was going to lead up to this big competition and something was going to happen there. Well, it
Yeah.
turned out that it was a great story. All we had to do is follow it and show the different
Yep.
perspectives. And there's this big ending, which was really, really cool. But
Yeah.
that's very different than almost investigative journalism, where you're digging into, well, what is it? This is a big macro
Hmm.
problem, and we get to choose what perspectives to show it from, uh,
Yep.
and that's endless, right? So it's like that's tough.
Very
So
much
good
so.
job, good job on
I
that.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah. Tinker away forever, but you got to ship it. You got to ship
that's
it.
right. That's right. I only have a couple more questions, and we'll wrap
Yeah.
up here. But you know, I like to ask people, how do you feel about based on a true story? This phrase that you see in movies, based on a true story. What's your feelings about it?
Oh man, that's such a loaded question, Jed.
It certainly was.
Yeah. Like I go to, I think one of my favorites, and I'm gonna butcher how it's said, but like at the beginning of Fargo, the movie or the TV shows, they have this funny spin on it where the names and places are true, but it's been changed to protect the victims and for
Right.
those that didn't survive. I forgot how they phrase it, but I always laugh when we're watching those. But based on a true story is so it can be interpreted a number of different ways, and that's where uh, yeah, that's where it's like I guess you have to do your research on it. I think the thing that I learned, there's a really good book by a guy named Matthew Dix called Storyworthy. And if you're familiar with the Moth podcast, which is a great storytelling
Yeah.
podcast, he's been like their all-time Story Slam champion. And funny enough, uh, call it God's timing or whatever, I listened to a podcast with him talking about how he tells stories. And it's very much constructed in a way to make it the most engaging without fibbing or lying, but what are the most prominent details that are necessary to tell the story, to communicate the thing that you're trying to communicate. And it's a gret book. I learned a lot about what is necessary to tell the story and what details don't need to be based on a true story, right? Versus what is actually the factual linear true story. So I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
answering your question.
No, it's enough.
Um,
I'm going to check that out. That's the second time this week that's come up. So I need to check out
yeah,
Storyworthy, and
yeah, it's a
I'm
great
familiar with the
book.
Moth, but I need to dig in on his stuff on there. So yeah,
Yeah.
I wrote about this in my book, where it's like it can be so tempting as storytellers to embellish, right? Because we're
Mhm.
fitting what feels like this emotional arc that we're crafting for our listener, our viewer.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
my theory is that that's a short game win, and
Yes.
not a
Yes.
long game win.
Hmm.
Um, and like a long game loss, or it can add up. Enough of those could add up to being a long game loss. And
Yeah.
I typically don't like to pick on other filmmakers because it's difficult. It's a difficult craft, and just finishing something um, is hard enough. But recently, I was kind of bummed. The the Sound of Freedom. Did you watch that?
I haven't seen it yet. No.
Yeah,
I
so
know
it's
what
the
you're talking. I
child.
know the
You know
topic.
about
Yeah.
it? It's the child
Yep.
trafficking story,
Hmm.
and it's based on this real guy, actual character. And like, I'm such a fan of true stories, but you have to keep it true, right?
Hmm.
I always watch these biopics and whatever, and the first thing I do, I'm not even done with the movie before I pull up my phone and look at Hollywood versus History and like see all of it. It's a
Uh-huh.
great
Yeah.
website. If you haven't checked it out, check out Hollywood versus History because it tells you everything that Hollywood said versus what was actually real in it. And I gotta
Yeah.
know every
Yeah.
time. I have to know. But The Sound of Freedom, although the message was great, the whole ending was not true. And so, like, you have
Mm.
all this true part, like, you 2/3 of your structure is true, and then you make up a fake ending. I'm like, I'm not for that. So,
Yep.
good, great message,
No,
good
it's
movie, but you can't
yeah.
dance like you can't dance on it being partially true.
Yeah. No,
That's what I'm saying.
yeah, it's no, I remember I was like heartbroken when I was younger. Like Braveheart was like the big film in the 90s that everybody like loved. And you're like, okay, William Wallace, like what a great story. And then when you start to like dig into it, like, yeah, he was like a sliver of like, what was actually happening. And like Robert the Bruce and his character
Yeah.
actually had more impact. And you're like, that was like my first like glass shattering moment. Like, oh wait, no, this actually isn't like as true as they say.
Right.
And it's the responsibility to your point, what you're saying, to like to be true, even if it's more sensationalized to go the other way. Especially now, where there are Hollywood versus history and real facts that
Right.
are out there. Like,
Right.
hey, truth will be found out, and it'll reshape everybody's perspectives if they, based on the story and how you've told it and how true you've told it. So,
Totally, and I think it's lazy to craft something that is seemingly sensational for the story arc, and not figure out the way to make the truth as
hmm
weighty as it was or is, right? Because like
hmm
I'll look at the Hollywood versus history points, and I'm like, you had all the elements. Like all you had to
yep,
do was couple more scenes with this character or a little bit more time on this arc, and the truth would have been weighty, right?
yeah,
So it's just like
uh-huh,
don't be lazy with it.
yep. No, that's a good point. All right, filmmakers out there, don't be lazy with it.
I
You heard
like
it
to
here.
talk. I like to talk about this topic with documentarians, especially because, like, obviously, that's what we're
Yeah,
trying to do is show something that is truth. But thank you so much for your time today. And a couple final questions for you. What are you working on now? Are you
yeah.
doing more brand storytelling like we are, or what are you doing
Yeah,
now?
so right now, I had a great season at Ramsey, but about a year and a half ago, I moved on to another endeavor, working with a great group up in Nashville called Cumberland Creative. And our focus is in brand storytelling. And that's the bread and butter, great direct to brand work. Really, and I think this is something that's been on the cusp of a lot of production companies. I know for you guys for years is the traditional model of advertising has shifted so much where culture now looks at it as like, unless it's a Super Bowl and you're looking forward to it, it's such an interruption. And with brand storytelling and people that have been at the forefront of it for years, like Patagonia and Yeti and some of the other ones, understood that, all right, we can express our brand values in a very authentic way that connects with audiences and drives deeper connection to our brand through this storytelling versus just buy our stuff and here's why you should buy it.
Right.
Um, but it's that, whole, Apple, right? Here's the crazy ones. Like this is the identity of who we are. And if that resonates with you, we're your people, right? And
Totally.
so that's the joy of brand storytelling now that I think we're in this arena. A lot of folks are in the arena of is communicating brand values through stories in authentic ways. And it's a very exciting time because, it's, mini documentary filmmaking. And I think it's very creative in the sense of what you can do. Excuse me. Very creative in the sense of what you can do with brands. And it's awesome to see that brands are excited and it's actually moving the needle for them.
Yeah, I recently became aware from this company called Admired Leadership of this topic of fanness. They use this word fanness, and they define that some of the strongest. It has to be real. It has to be authentic. But they define
Yeah.
leadership as being like, how much of a fan of this other person are you? Like if you really want them to
Yeah.
win, if you want to improve their life, they will pick up on that, and you will have leadership. It has to be authentic. I was thinking about that as it relates to Patagonia and some of the brands that you just mentioned, because I'm like, here they are spotlighting these people out in the world that are doing, I don't care if it's a pearl diver or someone who's climbing the peaks of Everest or whatever, but
Yeah.
they're spotlighting it in a way that we're like, we're your fans. Here's
Hmm.
this story about you. We're your people. We're your fans. And now we're going to
Yeah.
show you to the world, and you're going to have more fans. And what
Hmm.
it does is it's like, here's the tent. Patagonia, we're in it. Come on in with us, right? And it's pulling all these
Hmm. Yeah.
people in to say, to say we're your people, to your earlier point. And I just think that's incredibly powerful for brands to do. That's obviously what we preach
Yeah.
too. So I got to see some
Yep.
of the stuff you guys are putting out, and learn a thing or two, and keep sharpening the tools over here.
Uh, we're all learning from each other, which is a great thing about the day and age we live in, and it's great to share content and learn.
True, true. Well, thanks so much for being in the conversation, and we're going to do this again. We'll talk more about brand storytelling next time.
Love it. Thank you, Chad. Appreciate it, man.